This morning is really, I would say, a very, almost like a pinnacle piece to Jesus' ministry. We are in his ministry cycle. We are, according to this text and where we are, we're in the Feast of Booths, which is a fall feast. It's like a October feast for the Jews, and it is about 6 months before Passover, the next Passover, where Jesus is going to go to the cross. And so during this time period, Jesus is, this is where he is really showing who he is. He's really elevating the conversation to, I am the Messiah. I am the Christ. I am the one whom the prophets foretold. It is me. I'm the healer of the nations. I'm the one who brings all things into subjection under God. Me. And that's very offensive. We talked about that several weeks back. And so what we're about to see is we have to understand something about Christ. And this is partly why we're not Jews. Is because Jesus Christ fulfilled, he was the goal of the Old Testament law. And if you look into the law, what you find is not only was the law meant to point people to Christ in the sense of showing that they couldn't earn it, they couldn't be good enough to get to God on their own. They needed a Savior, and so the law was something they couldn't keep. But not only that, but the law helped point them and give them pictures of God's holiness and who the Messiah would be. Their ceremonial acts, the way they prepared things was all done in such a way that it had specific nuances of who the Messiah was going to be. If you've ever played a sport, you know that some sports require force and some require finesse. Finesse is like the idea of a nuance. I started playing tennis a little bit, and I realized that I can't just crank the ball, right? I mean, my idea is just hit it as hard as you can because that's like baseball, right? It's like everything, it's everything I've ever played. Just hit the person as hard as you can, hit the ball as hard as you can. But you learn that in tennis, you can't do that. If you watch the U.S. Open, you saw guys play for almost 5 hours straight, and they were still hitting the ball fractions of an inch from the line. And it's a nuanced sport. And when you look at the law has these beautiful, intricate nuances that give us pictures of who the Messiah is and was coming for the Jews. And so as we look at the Feast of Booths here, this is where Jesus is. Remember, there's 7 feasts according to the text in Leviticus that God gave to Israel. Starting in the spring, you have the Passover, you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you have the Feast of First Fruits. All those are kind of right back to each other, and they happen in the late mid-spring. 50 days from the end of that, you have what's called Pentecost, which is the Feast of Lights. It's like this harvest time feast where they've harvested the wheat crop and they celebrate. Then you go move into the fall, and you get the Feast of Trumpets. Then you get the Feast of Weeks. And then you get the Feast of Tabernacles, which is where we are today, the Feast of Booths. And so in this, every one of these feasts actually was a picture of Jesus. Every one of them showed what Jesus was going to do, who he was going to be, how he was going to act. And to be quite honest, depend on kind of your flavor of the end time theology. A lot of people believe that the spring feasts were all about his first coming, and his fall feasts were all about his second coming. There's intricate nuances that kind of tell us that we can look at these feasts and see different things about who Jesus is and what he was going to do, and they're wrapped up in him and they're fulfilled in him. Interestingly enough, we're going to look at some text today that explicitly shows how Jesus fulfills these feasts. Give you a quick text. This is going to be on the screen. This is in Colossians. It's Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 through 17. Paul tells the church at Colossae, he says, "Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. These things, which are mere shadows of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." Now, when you read this, you may not understand food, drink, festivals, new moon, Sabbath. What Paul is telling the church there is that If someone comes to you, remember this is Colossae is a Gentile community. There are Jews there, but he's telling them, if someone comes to you and says you need something other than Jesus Christ, you need Jesus Christ plus the Old Testament law, the food and drink, these were ceremonial laws. Don't eat this, don't eat that. Do things this way. The new moon, their whole calendar was built on the new moon. The festivals were built on the new moon, on the cycles of the moon. And so if they're coming to you saying the new moon is this and we need to do this, you need to remember that those are all pictures. They're shadows of what was to come in Jesus Christ. And then he says festivals, the feasts, all of these were just mere shadows of something that was found in Jesus Christ. And so if this is true, if Christ is the fulfillment of all these things, and Jesus is right here in the Feast of Booths, then more than likely there's something about this text that explains how Jesus is fulfilling and will fulfill this feast, and how this feast is a mirror picture of the Messiah. Now, most of us, when we read the text, I don't know about you, but I haven't necessarily been a guy that I have read some of the other what's called holy books or other books that other religions use. I've read a little bit of the Quran. I've read some of the Vedas. I've read a lot of the Talmud because of its Jewish relation to Christianity. But if you don't read some of these, specifically the Jewish writings, the Mishnah, the Gemara, those writings actually have some oral history, oral tradition that the Jews were never meant to write down. They were meant to keep it as an oral tradition because it wasn't to be law, but the Jews wrote it down anyway. The reason they wrote it down is because they were afraid they were going to lose it like they did when they were sent into captivity. And they didn't want to lose it, so they wrote it down, and then that oral tradition became law for them as well, unfortunately. But what's great about it is those things give us a history lesson about these feasts and about different traditions of the Jews. So what I want to do this morning is we're going to look at two separate texts. We're going to look at the end of chapter 7, and then we're going to just move over into the one verse in chapter 8, verse 12. Because believe it or not, the text that you get in the first part of chapter 8 doesn't belong there. I'll explain that next week when we teach on it. It doesn't belong there. It belongs somewhere else, okay? And if you take chapter 7 and you take chapter 8, verse 12, and you fit them together, you're going to see a continuation of Jesus' teaching at the Feast of Booths in the temple. And that's what we're going to look at today, just briefly, okay? So the question becomes this, is how did Jesus fulfill the Feast of Booths specifically? So, in chapter 23 of Leviticus, we have a little bit of what the Feast of Booths was about. But to really get an understanding of all the traditions that the Jews had, you have to go look at the Talmud. You have to look at specifically the writings within the Talmud in a book called Sukkah. Sukkah means booths, and it was all about this time and how the Jews were to worship God at the Feast of Booths. And so in this book, this section within the Talmud, there's all these great writings about what the traditions of the Jews were. And the Jews had 3 sacred ceremonies or sacred traditions that they did. One was, as we talked, it was the building of the sukkahs. It was the building of the booths. And that it was a 7-day period. They would build the booths, and they would build these kind of makeshift huts, and they would live in them, and they would celebrate in them as a remembrance to how God took them through the wilderness and how God had provided and protected them all the way through. But there were also a couple other ceremonies that the Jews did that aren't in the scripture, but are found in other writings. And so we look at history and we look at these other writings and go, okay, what were they doing ceremonially? And I'm going to give you 2 of them because the other 2 of them are very significant in picturing who Jesus is. If we say Jesus is the fulfillment of these feasts, and yet we don't understand how he fulfills the feast, then our concept of Jesus, our joy in understanding that who he is and what he's done and where he's going and what he's going to do for us gets lost. And so we want to look at that today. So the first thing we're going to look at is what's known as the pouring of the water. And that's your first big blank if you want to write it in there. It's called the pouring of the water. This was a ceremony that was done every day during the Feast of Booths. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. What would happen is early in the morning, it was done right before what they would call the morning offering time in the temple. And the priests would get up on the first day, and they would take 2 golden pitchers, and they would walk down to what is known as the Pool of Siloam. Okay, and I have a picture of it. Okay, I think it's up there. So this is a miniature illustration of the old city of Jerusalem. And so the pool, if you look up there, that wall up there, that's the temple complex. It's kind of the Temple Mount area, so to speak. That's not the temple itself. That's just kind of the outer wall of the complex. But if you look down here at the bottom, this is the old city of David. And down at the bottom, near the edge of the city, was what's called the Pool of Siloam. And Siloam was a spring that fed up, and it was specifically used as a ceremonial pool. Do you remember when Jesus healed the man who was blind, and he spit on the ground and he made mud and he rubbed it on the man's eyes, and he said, "Go wash in this pool." And so he did. It was a ceremonial washing. He was literally cleansing himself of the dirt, of the sin, so to speak, right? And he could see. What the Jews would do, these priests would go down and they would walk down to this pool. This is where they would ceremonially cleanse themselves as well. They would gather 2 big golden pitchers of water, and they would walk up this road right here. And right before you get to the temple, there's what's known as the water gate. They would go through the water gate with this water, and they would walk up to the temple. They would go into the temple complex, into the temple area, right next to the altar, and they would pour this water into a basin. And as they would pour it into a basin, they would also take wine and they would pour it into a separate basin right next to it. Then they would take the water and they would take the wine and they would pour out the water and the wine as a drink offering to the Lord. And the idea was that them pouring this out was to signify specifically all the miraculous provisions that God did while they were in the desert, while they were in the wandering period of time. If you remember, when they were in the desert, God did something miraculously with water. It's a desert. He had 1 million+ people to get water for. You don't just find it anywhere. He miraculously provided water for them. We're going to see that in a second. And there was this significance, and also it was a look to the future. It was a look ahead to how the Lord was going to pour out His Spirit on the people in the last days. We have tons of great texts. Joel 2, we're going to see some of those today, about how the Spirit's going to pour out. And so they would pour this water out as a drink offering. They would pour the wine out as a drink offering to the Lord to worship Him. And they did it every morning. Every morning they would get up and do this for this 7-day period. And on the last day, they would take the water up to the altar. They would circle the altar 7 times. And they would do it as a final celebration to the Lord. Now let's look at this text in John just briefly. This is Jesus. He's in the temple complex. The Bible says he's in this area known as the women's court, which we're going to see in a second. And look at what he says in verse 37. Now on the last day of the great feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." Stop for just a second. Now normally we'll read this text and we'll just be like, oh, He's already spoken to the woman at the well, right? Remember the Samaritan woman talk about, "I will give you water that wells up in its eternal life. I will give you water that will never run out." And she's like, "Give me this water so I don't have to keep coming back to this stupid well." Remember that? He says, "No, I'm talking about a spiritual water." And now Jesus is, so if we read this text, oftentimes we think back to that text earlier in John and we go, okay, he's just telling her more about this idea that he can give her spiritual water, which is true. But I want you to see the significance to the Jew. They are in the middle. They've been doing this ceremony every day. It's the last day. As you walk up, listen to this. As they would go from the pool up to the Temple Mount, there would be this. They would be singing Psalm 118. And they would do it every day. And it's one of the Psalms of Ascent. And as they would walk up to the temple, they would sing this psalm. And they would get into the temple complex. And it would be this incredibly worshipful time. And here Jesus stands. I can just imagine, again, we don't have this in the text, but you can imagine Jesus is there. It was a big parade coming in. And maybe he's standing in the temple complex as everybody's coming in, passing past him. Excuse me, can I get y'all's attention? If anyone is thirsty, like you were in the desert, I can give you better water than this. Do you see what's happening? He's identifying himself with this water, with this ceremony. He's saying, you've been doing this for years. I am this. I'm this thing. Keep looking at the text. Watch what he says. He who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his inmost being will flow rivers of water. Now, this is specifically the Spirit will be in us, refreshing us. It will be this refreshing thing that will be in you. We know this. Keep going. In verse 39, he says, but this he spoke of, the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. For the Spirit had not yet come because Jesus was not yet glorified. Because Jesus had not died, risen from the dead, and ascended, the Spirit hadn't come yet. The Spirit wasn't given just to anybody. The Spirit was not something that someone received unless God divinely enacted it upon them to have. Specifically, we saw this with the judges. We see this in the Old Testament with the kings, David and Saul. We see this in the Old Testament with the priests. God's Spirit would reside in them, those who were His, called by Him to do these things. And so He's saying, I can give you something. I can give you this water that you're carrying, but it's not just a symbol. It's something that I can give you. It's my Spirit. So what I want us to do is I want us to look at three things. We're going to look at how Jesus fulfilled this in the past. We're going to look at how He fulfilled it in the present. And then we're going to look at the future. So let's look at the first thing. Jesus in the past, He fulfilled this by giving water to Israel. Jesus gave water to Israel. And you're sitting here thinking, wait a second. Chris, how could Jesus be in the Old Testament? He's a New Testament guy, right? How did Jesus get into the Old Testament? Let's look at this text in Exodus. This is Exodus chapter 17. This is right after the Jews. This is the first incidences of the Jews leaving Egypt. They've passed through the sea, and they're in the desert, and they are thirsty. In verse 5 of chapter 17, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile. Remember when he struck the Nile and turned the water to blood in the Nile? This is the same staff. He said, and go, and behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. Remember, Mount Horeb was where He received the 10 Commandments. So this is where they are in the desert, right? And there's going to be a rock here. And he says, and you will strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of all the elders of Israel. Now, you need to understand this process. He takes his staff, him and the elders, Aaron's with him. He gathers all the people. They go to the base of Mount Horeb. There's a rock. We don't know which rock it is. It could be a little rock. It could be a massive rock. He takes his staff and he hits this rock with the staff. He strikes the rock with the staff, and out of the rock comes water. Now, think about that for a second. The rock has to be struck to get the water. Do you remember in Numbers chapter 20 when Moses did this again? The people did the same thing. They were in the desert complaining about the water. And Moses goes before the Lord. He said, take your staff, take Aaron, go to the rock. And this time, tell the rock what you want. Speak to the rock, and out of it will come water. And what did he do? Did he go and speak to the rock? He went to the rock, and he took his staff, and he was so mad at the people, it says that he struck it a second time. He hit it again. And God went, oh, dude, why'd you do that? The rock can't be hit again. The rock's already been struck. You don't strike the rock again. You have to strike the rock to get water out of it, but you don't strike the rock a second time. You speak to the rock, and it will give you the water. Do you see kind of what's happening here? 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul's telling the church at Corinth, he's explaining this scenario to them. And notice what he goes through and he talks about them moving from the desert, from Egypt through the river into the desert, and how God is providing manna for them, which we saw him as the bread of life, the bread from heaven earlier as he feeds the 5,000. He's fulfilling all of these things in the Old Testament. And as he gets to this section where Paul's telling the church at Corinth about this moment, look at what he says. In verse 4 of chapter 10, he says, for they drank, this is the Israelites, they drank from the spiritual rock. And notice in your Bible, it's probably capitalized. Interesting. They drank from a spiritual rock that followed them. Wait, what? This rock wasn't just a random rock in the desert. This rock was like sneaking. You know? It's no wonder they ran it in circles. You know, don't you use landmarks as your guide? Oh, we passed that rock before, right? So they go, look, notice the rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. This whole ceremony that the Jews have been doing is the idea that they're celebrating this water that came from a rock in the desert, and that this water is ultimately going to signify the Spirit coming in the future. And Jesus says, hold up, I will give you this water. How can he say that? Because he's already done it. He did it for Israel. It's the same guy. You don't believe me? We'll get to that in a second. I'll explain that in a second. So now let's look at the present. So this is what he did for Israel in the past. Jesus gave them water. And now what you're going to see is Jesus gives his Spirit to the church. We just saw that John is prepping us for that. He's saying this to the Jews and to the people as he's writing John. He's illustrating for us what did happen or what was going to happen. And we see this in Galatians as Paul's telling the church at Galatia what this concept of the Spirit, God's Spirit indwelling us and coming upon us and being in us at the moment of our conversion, and we trust in Jesus Christ and we ask him to be our Lord. This is what Paul says. He says, because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. This is what has happened to the church. He gives his Spirit to us. We are the recipients, so to speak, right now of this living water. He was going to these Jews saying, you can get this from me. We, 2,000 years later, have got it from him. He gives it to the church. And not only that, but notice, in the future, Jesus will give it to everyone. Jesus is going to give it to everybody. The Bible says in Joel chapter 2, this is a prophecy about the end times. It's a prophecy about the future that is to come that we haven't seen yet. He says, after this, I will pour out my Spirit on who? All humanity. Now, if you're ever curious, if you keep reading in this text, he's going to explain what's happening around this time when he begins to pour out his Spirit, and you're going to see it's eerily similar to the sermon that Jesus gives in Matthew 24, 25. Called the Olivet Discourse, which he talks about the end times, and it's eerily similar to the book of Revelation. He's going to pour out his Spirit on everybody. Jesus is fulfilling this, and he's fulfilled it then, he's fulfilling it for us now, and he's going to fulfill it even greater in the future. Okay, so let's keep looking. Now we have to skip some texts. We're going to come back to these another time, but we have to skip a few texts for just a second. And we're going to skip over now to John chapter 8. And I want to explain just briefly why we're doing this, okay? So between this piece of text here where Jesus explains that he's relating that I give you water that will last and well up for you for eternal life. He then... There's an insertion of a text that is John, it starts in 53 and it runs through chapter 8, verse 11. This text is equated to Jesus, and it was passed around during the all throughout history, but in the early, probably from the early first 600 years of the church, from Christ to about the 5th century, it wasn't in any of the early manuscripts that we have. Now, it was absolutely a story that was told, but it wasn't necessarily, we don't have any record of it. But from 600 on, we have a lot of manuscripts with it in there. And so here's what's believed, is at some point in time, this story that was equated to Jesus was so ingrained in the culture is that people, the scribes, just put it in. Most theologians today don't believe that either one, that it doesn't need to be there, it needs to be somewhere else, or that it just was never inerrant or never God's word in the first place and it just didn't belong. It's kind of like reading a commentary, right? When you read commentary from somebody, it's not the word of God. Now, it's good. Oftentimes, it's really good. And so when we read this text, my personal opinion is this. I believe it should probably be in the Bible or we wouldn't have it there, just my opinion. But I don't believe necessarily that John wrote it. And the reason is there's a lot of internal evidence, and when we talk about that next time, I'll explain some of that. So look for me for just a second. If you take this text and you put it somewhere else in the Bible, and you take this section in John chapter 8, verse 11, and you butt them right up next to what we are just reading in John chapter 7, they make a seamless picture of Christ talking about who he is and how he's fulfilling the Feast of Booths. Specifically, we first started with the feast of, or the pouring of the water. Next, we start with what's called the Festival of Lights. The Festival of Lights. This will be your next big blank. The Festival of Lights was a big celebration that was done, and it was done every day, once again. And I want to give you some pictures because this is really neat how we've illustrated this. Again, we don't know. We just have the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, that actually tells us specifics about what the Jews did. But during the Feast of Lights, you had this in the temple complex, in the court of women, they had these massive, tall, 75-foot high pillars covered in gold. And I have some pictures. Go to the first picture for me, Dave. So this is a picture of what the temple complex would have looked like as a whole. And the temple itself is seen in the center part there. And the tall piece there would be the inner courts and the Holy of Holies area. This is where only the priests would go. They would prepare themselves. And then the back half of that tall area would be the Holy of Holies. They had this massive veil that went from the ceiling to the floor. And remember when Christ died, it said the veil was ripped starting at the top. And so they would go into that area of the Holy Holies and they would present their offerings before the Lord. Out in front of this is called the Court of Women. And this is an area that the Jews would go and they would have celebration. And in that court right there, that front area that's kind of open space, hit the next slide for me, Dave. There's a couple of these. You can see these are just illustrations because we don't have a temple there. Right now there's an Islamic mosque is sitting there right now, okay? We don't have the temple. This is just based on what we know from history and what's been written about it. But you notice in that court of women, you see those big kind of candelabras, those big menorahs that's standing up. This is just somebody's idea about it. Here's another picture of what it could look like. There's this idea, now you get more of a perspective. I'm in this court of women, maybe standing at the door or on a balcony in the back, and I'm looking, and they built these massive 75-foot candelabras, really. And on top of each one, the Talmud says, was 4 massive bowls. And they would have these young, strong guys carry oil to the tops of these things on ladders. And they would pour just fill them up with oil. And then, this is kind of interesting, they would take the priest's underwear. And they would, old underwear, and they would roll them up, and they would make these wicks. And they would set them in this oil, and they would light it on fire. Go to the next one. There it is. And this is kind of, I like this one because you're like on the ground, right? You're in the place, looking back at the temple itself. And as they would light this, you got to remember, this temple is on a hill. And those menorahs, those candelabras are way above the temple complex. And as they would light these things, they would light the entire valley. They would light the Mount of Olives to the east. They would light the city over to the west. They would light the whole area. And all of Jerusalem could see because of the light that was coming from the temple. And what they would do is as they would light these things, they would sing and they would party and they would play music and they would dance. And the Talmud talks about the dancers dancing and the joy that was happening during this ceremony of them lighting this. And the idea was that this celebration signified what God had done for them in the desert. Do you remember what He did in the desert? In a pillar of fire every day, leading them, guiding them, every night, a pillar of smoke during the day, a pillar of fire at night, leading them, guiding them, protecting them. Do you remember this? Let's look at this text. This is in John chapter 8, verse 12. Notice what Jesus says now. He says, then Jesus spoke again to them saying, I am the light of the world. He just said, I'm going to give you water that will quench your thirst forever. Now He's saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So let's do this. Let's look at the past. If Jesus was the rock giving them water, if Jesus gives us the Spirit, His Spirit to live in us, if Jesus is going to give the Spirit to everybody, He's going to do something similar here, right? If this ceremony really does a picture of who Jesus is, if this feast and all that it entails is a picture of Christ and He fulfills it or will fulfill it, we've got to see it somewhere, right? Let's look at Exodus chapter 13. It'll be on your screen for you. This is one of the incidences specific to this time period. As a matter of fact, I believe this is one of the first times where the pillar of fire happens. In verse 21 of 13, it says, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lead them along the way, and by night a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. If you were to skip over in your Bible to Exodus chapter 14, verse 19, specifically, the Bible calls this pillar of fire the angel of the Lord. You want to know who else is called the angel of the Lord? If you look back at Exodus chapter 3, when Moses is being confronted by this burning bush. Remember this? He walks up, he sees a bush burning. He's talking to this bush. The Bible says that the angel of the Lord was the bush. Was in the bush. That's the fire that was glowing. The same fire that is burning here in the desert, the angel of the Lord. And when Moses says, who am I to say sent me? Remember the bush to the fire says, hey, go to Egypt. I'm going to give you a voice. You're going to be my messenger to get my people out of Egypt. And Moses says, who am I to say sent me this? Am I just going to say I saw a burning bush in the wilderness? They're going to say you're crazy. And what did God say to tell him? He said, tell him I am. Look back at that text in John chapter 8. What did Jesus say about the light? He said, I am the light. Do you see this here? This light, this fire that was burning in the bush, I believe was Christ. I believe the fire that led them in the desert was Christ. I believe the glory that filled the temple when Solomon built it and it was consecrated was Christ. And now Jesus is saying, I am the light of the world. So in the past, Jesus was the light for Israel. And now in the present, Jesus is the light in the church. He's fulfilling this for us now. This is Ephesians 5, 8 through 10, and notice what it says. For you were once in darkness. Not in darkness. You were once darkness. I love how it's worded. You're not just in darkness. You were darkness. And now you are the light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light. For the fruit of the light results in goodness. That's our relationship with others. Righteousness. That's our relationship with God. And truth. That's our relationship with the world. With all things. We now can see things in a right manner. Discerning what is pleasing to the Lord. You are light. Why? How? In the Lord. Because of the Lord. Because He is the light. He was the light in the desert. John gives so many illustrations of Him being the light for us. What does the psalmist say? Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. What does John say the Word is in John chapter 1? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus is the light. And in the future, look what He's going to do. This is Revelation 21. And I saw no temple in this city. This is John being transported into the future. He now sees the world made new. He sees heaven made new. He sees the earth made new. And he sees a city of Jerusalem coming down. And in this city, notice what he says, there is no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. It's Christ. The city does not need the sun, and it does not need the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. Do you see this? Guess what? If you didn't know anything about the Jews, if you didn't know anything about this, would you have seen this? When you read Colossians chapter 2 and you see the new moon festivals, don't let anybody judge you about those festivals. Don't let anyone judge you about those feasts and all that stuff, because they're just shadows. That Old Testament fire that was in the desert was a shadow of who Christ is. That water that poured from a rock was just a shadow. It was just a basic outline to give you direction so that when the Christ came, you would know Him. And here the Jews are, doing their ceremonies, pouring their water, praying, dancing, singing, getting up there, lighting those lights. Everybody's partying. It's a great party, and the Messiah is standing right there going, hey, fellas, I'm the light. I'm the light. Me. I'm the water. I'm the one that's going to give you this thing that's going to heal your land. Me. So here's the question. It's not on your sheet. The question is, why is that important? We're 2,000 years later. We're not Jews. Why is it important that we understand how Jesus fulfilled these things and will fulfill these things? And here's why. I'm going to read you a little section of text. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. And this is from an unknown rabbi. And he's just commenting about this ceremony. Because you got to remember, this ceremony for the Jews was the pinnacle ceremony. It's the last one. On their year, it was like the third one. But it was this, as they launched into their year, there's this huge break of time. It was seen as the end of the harvest, the end of the season. They're about to go into their winter time of death, a time of slowing down. And they were celebrating. It was the greatest celebration, and this is how it's described 1,400 years ago. He who has not beheld this celebration has never seen joy in his life. Now that's a Jew speaking about a festival that's designed to point them to Jesus. Now stop for just a second. Why is this important? Because I'm gonna go out and say it. If you've never beheld Christ, if you've never looked upon Him, notice I close my eyes to look upon Him. If you've never trusted in this person, you've never celebrated with a joy that is inexpressible, and you don't know it. You don't know it. And church, here's what's crazy. I think so many of us who have beheld the Christ, who have put our trust in the Messiah, I think so many of us today still don't understand the celebration. We don't understand the joy of our salvation. We don't truly get what it means that Christ fulfilled these things, that He is the healer. He is the Messiah who comes to reconcile and take away our sin and give us not only full access to God, but freedom in His grace, and divinely enables us to walk on this earth and fulfill His purposes and see Him daily, clearly, in our mind. Is that you? Do you see Him that way? Do you wake up in the morning excited because of the joy of the Lord is where you find your strength, not in your own work, in your own hands, in your own desires, but in Him? And I don't believe that we truly understand this. You want to know how why I think that? Because I look at myself and I walk in these doors, and don't get me wrong, not just on a Sunday. I love to come into these doors, but how do you worship God when you come in these doors? Do you feel like you have to do you feel like you have to put on this barrier and kind of you get stiff? Do you feel free to worship the Lord? Most of us don't. We don't feel comfortable. The Jews would dance and they would sing. We get scared of that because we're not necessarily a Pentecostal church. We're like, if you're dancing, something's wrong with you, right? That's crazy. The idea is that the joy of the Lord is found in Jesus through the power of His Spirit that He puts in us, His presence in us. This is important because I think so much of the church nowadays is scared. We're scared because we look at this world and the culture and we don't want to express a true joy because we're going to be seen as weird. We come into the church and we don't want to let our heart be free to worship Him because we don't want to be seen as weird. And what we don't understand is that all that we have that's been given to us that is good comes from Christ. And the reality of this life is found in Him, in Christ alone, no one else. So here's the thing. It's hard to do this, specifically because most of the time when we come to church, we bring our bags with us. We bring our baggage. We bring our pain. The point of this celebration that you see here is that Jesus goes, I'm here to fix that. I'm here to fix this. I'm going to heal that. I can take that away. That's called grace. That's His grace. And that's what the cross does. It heals us. It heals our pain. It heals our soul.